Hello, everyone. So first of all, welcome. Thank you so much. I want to first start off by thanking you for kind of blocking off this time to join us for another series in our criminal justice lecture series. We're super excited about our guest for today. We're super excited that you all have carved up time to join us. Definitely let us know where you're joining us from in the comments section. I know we have a lot of students from our program who will be tuning in today, so we want to know what school you're representing. So definitely drop that into the chat. I also want to let you know that there'll be a lot of time for you to ask questions to the alderman on our topic today. So don't be shy. Please send in your questions. As we jump in, I want to kind of give you an introduction of sorts of who we'll be talking to today. Alderman Matt Martin is serving his first term as the alderman of the 47th Ward. Prior to being elected, Matt worked as a civil rights attorney at the Illinois Attorney General's office, where he worked on important issues including police reform, immigration, healthcare, and workers' rights. As an alderman, Matt believes it is critical to be independent, transparent, hallelujah, and willing to take on big challenges like maintaining and expanding affordability and fully funding our schools and reforming our police department. I think we're in for a really special treat. Today, I'm so excited that the person leading us in that discussion is our very own Jasmine. Jasmine is a program officer for school support and also a Chicago debate alum. She also is an alum of the University of Michigan. So great person, and I think you're going to be richly blessed. So I'm gonna bring them into the room now. So won't you help me welcome them by saying hello to both Jasmine and Alderman Martin.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Alderman Martin. Thank you for joining us. I know we have a lot of our students and coaches on the call, and so begin to prepare questions that we'll take at the end of the conversation. But welcome. I first wanted to just chat a little bit about what an alderman does, kind of what your kind of day-to-day tasks are, maybe what your favorite part about being an alderman is, and kind of what made you decide to run to be an alderman.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jasmine. I appreciate this opportunity to chat with you as well as the rest of the attendees today. So I think of my job as having two big buckets. The first is hyperlocal. So when you're thinking about issues that folks have that affect them most immediately, oftentimes it's a cracked sidewalk, it's a pothole that needs to be filled, a tree that needs to be trimmed, a garbage can that needs to be replaced. We, of course, have plenty of different city departments that do that sort of work, but oftentimes a liaison, a middle person is necessary to help coordinate the efficient delivery of those services. And that's where an aldermanic office comes in, when folks are able to talk with us to say, hey, I need this done, but I'm not sure if that's a city issue or where in the city to go. We can provide that information, as well as if they feel like they've already reached out to the department and maybe haven't received the sort of response, maybe timeliness that they would like, we can step in and see if something's fallen through the cracks. That comprises a big portion of my day-to-day, as well as the folks who work in my office. Second big issue is around legislation. I mean, I'm a legislator. I'm part of that sort of deliberative body. And so when it comes to holding hearings, providing oversight over our various departments, as well as introducing and passing legislation, just like any other legislator, whether you're at the General Assembly in Springfield or in Congress in DC, that's part of my job too. I guess I'll finish by saying why I was interested in becoming an alderperson, and unsurprisingly, it tracks with the sorts of responsibilities that I have. The first is that when I and my wife moved into our home in the Lincoln Square area, we started to get involved in our community. I started up a neighbors association, joined the local school council at the school my son now attends, and just saw the ways in which those institutions flourish when you have terrific aldermanic support. Second is, as you had indicated, maybe Anthony earlier, the sort of work I was doing at the Attorney General's office involved police reform. And that was something where I got to see, working on that case that resulted in a federal consent decree, that there is a long history, several decades, of our mayors as well as city council members not really leading on this issue, not taking it seriously. And as a result, we have a very, very sad past and in some ways present involving police misconduct that involves not just systemic abuses of constitutional violations, but also significant sums of money that we've paid out in settlements and judgments. And so when it comes to my fiduciary responsibility, as well as just more broadly being a good steward of my ward, I think that that's a critical thing that helped me decide to run. And it's been a big area of focus for me since I joined City Council a little over a year ago.
Yeah, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but kind of that mix between kind of local politics and how that kind of relates to what the state is doing, or even kind of what's happening on the Hill in DC right now. So can you talk a little bit about how kind of local politics affects something like criminal justice systems?
I think that there's a very consistent feedback loop that we see for a number of reasons. One is, even though there are ways in which our state and our federal government can step in and provide resources, provide oversight, put in place regulations around policing, public safety more generally, police departments are operated, managed at the local level, right? We're not talking about the National Guard, a state issue. We're not talking about the military, a federal issue. This is a quintessentially local issue. And so there are times where if you're talking about certain state laws around collective bargaining agreements and issues around accountability embedded in those agreements that need to change, process or substance, we might talk with our state colleagues to see what changes need to happen there. When it comes to information sharing, especially comparing our practices, how we resource our police department relative to other sister cities, that's where the federal government can really come in handy, being that central repository. So in one fell swoop, we can see, well, officers per capita, how do we compare to other large cities like New York, DC, Houston? What about our clearance rates involving homicides and gun crime? What about just the number of shootings that are happening year over year? These are the sorts of things where I think the federal government is very well situated to both collect that data, analyze it, and then provide some suggested next steps. I would say that during President Trump's tenure, we haven't seen a lot of forward momentum in that regard. It's not something that they have prioritized. That wasn't the case during President Obama's tenure. So my hope is that we see a return to that form, because we really need, as evidenced by the unfortunate murders and killings that we've seen, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor and the like, but also the demands, the consistent demands for police reform. We need to have a strong federal partner so that at the local level, we can do the best possible job.
Yeah, for sure. And then kind of looking at kind of policing specifically when it comes to the city of Chicago, what are some kind of current issues you would say they're currently facing Chicago policies around policing as it stands currently?
Yeah, I think there are no shortage of issues. One big one is we're trying to figure out, or starting to have a conversation around, what appropriate staffing looks like, because we have, in so many ways, a tale of two cities in Chicago when it comes to affordability of housing, when it comes to wealth and employment, unemployment, school resources, but also the ways in which crime touches us directly and indirectly. And for a lot of folks throughout the city, they might view the police department as perhaps the only tool available to government to help reduce crime in some way or another. I don't think that's the case. I think that there are other tools that are at our disposal, or could be if we were thinking creatively, but you have some folks who are saying, hey, if we see an uptick in gun violence, for example, I want more officers. Conversely, some folks, they don't feel as safe when officers are around. So we're navigating that. And I think a big way of helping provide some clarity is a better understanding of the staffing decisions and the analyses that are based on those decisions when it comes to how many officers do we want patrolling? If they're not patrolling, what other sorts of work should they be doing? And so understanding community policing principles and how we can better infuse that within the department, I think, is really critical. Another related component is ways in which we can improve trust between the police department and the communities within which they work. Because as I mentioned earlier, homicide rates and gun violence clearance rates, Chicago sees some of the lowest in the entire country when it comes to that. And a big reason why is that folks who are aware of possible perpetrators or folks who would have information about perpetrators of certain types of crimes, they don't trust the police to investigate that fully and to hold folks accountable. And as a result, we see this self-perpetuating cycle of crime occurring in certain communities, and then folks not working with the police or detectives to help solve those crimes because they don't trust that anything's going to be done with that information based on several decades of really problematic conduct and behavior by the police department. So that's big. I think a final thing is making sure that from a disciplinary standpoint, when officers do engage in misconduct, that we're able to hold them accountable. There are a lot of different facets to that maybe I won't get into all of them, but one big one I think is making sure that we have civilian oversight over our police department so that you have folks who don't have a pre-existing relationship with the police department can independently, with kind of clear mindset, look and see, hey, where is stuff working well, where is it not? From an accountability standpoint, we're working to pass that sort of legislation, hopefully in the next several months.
Yeah, for sure. And I think kind of one thing that might like fit into that bucket are body cameras. One argument that our debaters and our coaches this year will be learning more about in the coming, academic year are body cameras and policies around body cameras on the national stage. So can you talk a little bit about what current body camera policies are in place in Chicago currently?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have a pretty good policy, which I'll get into, but then a related set of concerns around procurement. So first, the policy itself, which is in part required through the federal consent decree that I mentioned earlier, which is anytime someone is responding to a call for service or otherwise engaging with a member of the public, you're supposed to have on your body, on your person, body cam that you activate. And I think that there are lots of benefits to be that provides. One is if someone knows as an officer they're recording the situation, I think that there's a greater likelihood that they will treat individuals in a respectful manner, especially the language that's used. Certainly, if there is an allegation of misconduct and that cam is used appropriately, you get an important perspective on what transpired, what occurred, which can help, again, if someone puts in a complaint around alleged officer misconduct, but also if it's a frivolous complaint, that's something that officers could benefit from, having that footage. And so there are times when some complaints you can kind of deal with them fairly quickly because the content of the complaint does not match in a meaningful way what's on the body cam. So I think there's a benefit both to officers as well as the public when they're used appropriately. And that's a big thing I want to underscore, when they're used appropriately. We recently had a shooting by an officer of a member of the public, and that officer did not have a body cam on them. So there was not the sort of evidence that we come to expect when we have these sorts of shootings that occur. We're working as a city to do a better job of procuring those cams and making them broadly available to anyone who could conceivably respond to a call for service, so that, again, we're working on building up that trust, because the last thing we want to have happen is one or more high-profile shootings where we don't have that body cam footage, and the reason why is either it was on the person, the officer, and they didn't activate it, or it wasn't on them, but it should have been.
Yeah, you spoke to that kind of one incident where the police officer wasn't wearing the body camera. Overall, do you think they've increased transparency and accountability the current policies that are in place around body cameras?
Yeah, it's certainly improved, but there are lots of areas for growth. As I mentioned, we still don't have 100% coverage in terms of all the folks who should have body cams, in fact, having them. And then there are situations where the cams are not activated or to a lesser extent aren't working in appropriate ways. And that's where I think someone in my position, it's important for us when we're overseeing our department that we're asking those questions at various points throughout the year. Also working with our Inspector General's office, who's tasked, among other things, with doing regular audits of different aspects of our police department to see where there are areas of improvement. And just as a little bit of an example there, part of the consent decree obligations for officers is that if you're a supervisor, you're supposed to be reviewing body cam footage in incidents where someone, say, has used force against a member of the public. Certainly, if they've discharged their firearm, if there's a misconduct complaint. So part of the muscle memory we need to build into our police department is supervisors routinely reviewing that footage closely to see, based on that footage, what transpired to the best of their knowledge. So we need to do a better, more consistent job of reviewing that footage from a supervisor standpoint. And I hope and expect we will do a better job in the coming months and years.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you also kind of touched on this a little bit, but based on your experience within the state attorney general's office, and kind of now what you do when it comes to Chicago policies here, what do you think the role of like state government versus local government is when talking about criminal justice reform?
Hmm. I think that's a good point. It might vary a little bit state to state or city to city. If you're a town of 5,000 people versus a city like Chicago of 2.7 million people, different sorts of conversations in terms of the resources that the city is able to bring to bear, both just money, personnel, nonprofits that might operate in the area that can help do some of the heavy lifting. So I think that's important. But in terms of Chicago in particular, I view in part the state government as a backstop because we have this very tragic history in Chicago of many decades of sustained police misconduct, despite that misconduct being broadly known within and outside of city government. And so my former employer, for example, the state attorney general's office, we actually had to step in and sue the city to bring about a set of reforms that were necessary. And specifically, there were a set of reforms that we had been talking about as a city for decades. I mean, this goes back all the way to 1973. The congressman on the South Side, Ralph Metcalf, who convened a series of public hearings, commissioned a blue ribbon report to talk about the problems and solutions that we continue to talk about to this day. The city failed. I don't think that's too strong a language to adopt a great majority of those policies. And so it was important that the state be able to step in, hold the city's feet to the fire, hold them accountable so that we could start providing the sort of services that people need and expect throughout the city. The last thing I'll say is there are laws that either need to be rewritten or created anew when it comes to collective bargaining issues, or something that has come up most recently that is pretty novel, but an interesting idea is if you want to require officers to be licensed and or carry insurance in order to be able to do their jobs. It's something like if you go to a barber or a stylist, there's a requirement that they be licensed, and as a part of that licensing process that they check certain boxes. As folks have asked, well, from a risk management standpoint, if you have a certain relatively modest set of officers who have a lot of complaints that are lodged against them and a portion of them that are sustained, well, if our current system is not capable or consistently does not hold them accountable, then there might be other structures to bring to bear such that an insurer might say, we're not going to insure Officer X because of their long and troubled complaint history, kind of forces the hand of the city to say, okay, this is someone who we're going to have to part ways from. So we'll continue to have conversations with our state colleagues to see how to move ideas like that forward. Again, the sorts of things where we'll have to rely on their leadership, because we don't have the sort of systems in place in Chicago to hold officers accountable when that misconduct does occur.
Wow, yeah, I didn't even know that. So I think that kind of brings me to my next question about just current activism in the city of Chicago around criminal justice reform, and just the kind of education of our citizens and the organizing that is taking place in our city. Can you speak a bit to like the activism and just the organizing in general, and how that's impacting the current efforts to reform policing in Chicago?
I am incredibly thankful for the folks who have put in so much time and effort, especially those who are doing this professionally or for compensation. They're, I think, the single biggest reason why we're having conversations like this that are being foregrounded, because before the video of George Floyd's murder came out, I think you were, and that was a real galvanizing moment from an activism standpoint. I think the city government, city council included, wasn't taking police reform as seriously as it needed to. And that changed, and it changed because of that activism. And we continue to see sustained efforts from individuals and organizations, which is incredibly important, around a number of issues, some of which I'll go through quickly. One is taking a closer look at the ways in which we resource our police department, especially relative to other departments. We spend in Chicago, I think maybe second to New York last year, more per capita than any other city in the country. But a lot of the outcomes aren't what we would want, or certainly what we need, when it comes to those low homicide and gun violence clearance rates. So activists have said, hey, what are we going to do differently with regard to this budget? I mentioned earlier around civilian oversight over the police department. We have two strong proposals, both of which I've co-sponsored, that need a hearing, need to have votes. But that's something where folks say, look, is great as it is to hear you, Matt, talk about issues in your official capacity, we know that generally speaking throughout Chicago's history, that its elected leaders haven't been up to the task. And so it stands to reason that we need to bring more of a civilian voice to the conversation about police reform. Finally, are issues where we're talking about alternatives to policing when it comes to public safety. And so a lot of activists have been pushing us to consider, and we are considering, variations of this model that was piloted in Eugene and Springfield, Oregon. And the idea that the program is called Cahoots there, where you pair a paramedic with a crisis worker, and they respond in those cities to 20% of all the calls for service. So examples might be someone who's having a mental health episode and they don't pose a safety risk to themselves or others, someone who's enduring homelessness, situations where you don't need an armed officer in a lot of situations responding. Instead, you need folks who have training in healthcare, as well as folks who have training in crisis management. We're starting to see, based on this moment, that activists have helped maintain places like San Francisco, Oakland, Albuquerque, Denver, adopting variations of that Cahoots program. We're trying to do the same here in Chicago, and I don't know that we would be able to have that conversation and hopefully bring that program about without activists making demands that we be more innovative with regard to public safety.
Yeah, and I think one kind of section of that activism and that organizing that has been so prevalent and important, especially just within recent months, has been the youth, the kind of students, and the kind of action and activism they've kind of put forward. And so, can you kind of tell us a little bit about that student activism, specifically around just school resource officers? I know we have a few debaters and coaches on the call that are specifically in the 47th Ward, and is something that they've had conversations around. So you can kind of speak a little bit to the school resource officers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a terrific example of youth activism and how critical it's been to changing the conversation and to changing policy. So for folks in this meeting who might not be aware, school resource officers are police officers who are permanently placed in schools. In Chicago, that happens primarily at our local high schools within Chicago Public Schools. And it's something that for the last number of years we've known is a really big problem. The Shriver Center on Poverty put out a study several years ago talking about a lot of the problems associated with that system, ultimately recommending that the system be dismantled. You had a series of reports from the city's inspector general calling into question the program's advocacy, talking about how officers were not adequately trained and supervised, the sort of problems that would consistently arise. So that was a big issue. And then we've also had some data that's coming out of places, including the University of Florida, showing that when you have officers who are permanently placed in our high schools, that you see a higher propensity for Black students in particular to be referred to the police relative to non-Black counterparts. So real issues involving the school to prison pipeline. And it was through the consistent advocacy efforts of youth in particular in Chicago that resulted in hearings being held both at the city council level as well as the Chicago Public Schools Board, that in a good number of our high schools, the local school councils listened to those students and actually voted to discontinue their relationship with those school resource officers in terms of being permanently placed. So I don't think you would see that sort of success without the sort of advocacy from youth. And in addition to, I think, the passion that they can bring to bear and the research that they can help collect, it's also the fact that they're uniquely well positioned to talk about their firsthand experiences of currently or recently having been CPS students and what it feels like to be in a school where there's a police officer who's permanently placed there. I think that sort of firsthand testimony has been invaluable.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I have one more question for you, Alderman, and then we'll open it up to just any viewers who have any questions. So feel free to start dropping questions into the comment section now. But kind of my final question, kind of on that thought of youth, and for our debaters that are on the call, for any debaters that are a part of our organization that kind of want to get more involved, want to learn more about Chicago politics, whether that be the criminal justice system, whether that be affordable housing in Chicago. What are any tips you have for our youth out there to get more involved in local politics?
One thing I would certainly say is consume local media. We've got lots of terrific options, and at the risk of offending folks who I won't name, and clearly we have flagship newspapers like the Chicago Sun-Times, the Chicago Tribune. You also have local outfits like Block Club Chicago that are doing a great job of talking about hyperlocal issues, but engaging organizations, be they more community-based or wonky nonprofits that are doing lots of innovative work in this regard. And so I would say, feed your curiosity, consume that information, and figure out which sorts of individuals and organizations are talking about things in a way that you find compelling and or you have questions of them, and then reach out. I mean, you could reach out, of course, to the reporters, but you could reach out to those individuals and organizations directly, so that you can have a better sense of if I'm really interested in transportation equity, well, I can talk with this organization. If I'm interested in disability rights advocacy, this organization or individual is great. Same thing with regard to policing and public safety, environmental sustainability issues. So I think if you want to get a better sense as to what the Chicago or even community specific concerns are in these sorts of areas, as well as the potential next steps that we can take to improve, we've got lots of folks who are spending their time personally or privately to wrap their heads around this and advocate. So read, talk, reach out to folks, be proactive. And I think you'll generally see a group of individuals and organizations that are eager to explain what they're doing, what their worldview is, but also folks who, whether it's with them personally or others, have suggestions around how you can get active to the extent you're interested and able to do so.
Yes, and definitely needed during a time like this. So I see a couple questions starting to come in from our viewers. The first question we have here is 2020 has brought challenges with local and state budgets due to the coronavirus pandemic. How will this affect policing reform efforts due to funding and or focus?
It's a really terrific question. I have at this point multiple conversations every day with folks about it. And the short answer is I'm not sure just yet, in part because I don't know that we've seen lots of really progressive, innovative actions being taken by other city governments, in particular other city councils and sister cities. What I'm focused on here in Chicago is having a better sense, one, of what those budget gaps actually are. And we are told that for the current fiscal year, it's $800 million due primarily to a loss of income from COVID. And the next year, 2021, $1.2 billion. So over this 2-year period, $2 billion. So getting a better sense of where specifically those revenue losses are coming from. But also understanding, well, if we have to make some challenging budgetary decisions, which I think we will from an expenditure standpoint, what are the core competencies of our different departments, and how are the ways in which we have resourced them, at least currently, how does that compare to those competencies? And if you're in a situation where, as a department head, you aren't able to concisely and persuasively explain how the budget you're proposing matches the sort of services that you think you need to provide and that you're uniquely well situated to provide, then I think that we're going to have some challenges, and we're going to have a lot of follow-up conversations in that regard. So we have, as I had mentioned earlier, a very large police department, not just on its own, but relative to the police departments in other cities. We have 3,000 to 4,000 fewer officers than the city of Los Angeles, for example. We spend more on police misconduct lawsuits than LA and New York combined. Our overtime costs are just running away from where we've budgeted them for this year. And so I think in this moment where a lot of folks are also concerned about an uptick in certain types of crime, particularly gun crime, that we need to be very thoughtful and very straightforward around how we're looking at that budget and the ways in which we can improve public safety broadly. Because as I mentioned earlier, a lot of folks, too many in my mind, think that the only way to maintain and improve public safety is through an increase in the number of police officers. There might be situations in which that's the case, but there are lots of situations where it's not. So I think that we need to be really creative and ask a lot of hard-hitting questions, not just assume that whether it's the police department or some other department, that whatever they ask for is exactly what we should appropriate as city council. We need to be more thoughtful than that. Yeah,
for sure. Another question we have coming in is on predictive policing. That is another topic that our debaters and coaches will be learning and taking a deeper dive in this year. So the question is, what is your stance on predictive policing and the use of algorithms to predict crime hotspots to inform policing?
That's a really interesting question. So it's something that I'm aware of we do in Chicago, especially when it comes to certain areas where we've seen spikes in gun violence over the last several years. I'm not as familiar with it when it comes to the 47th Ward specifically, in part because gun crime is a little lower over here. So I just have fewer occasions to talk with, say, police commanders and other police personnel about how it impacts the 47th Ward specifically. I will say that, look, at a high level, the fact that we're running an algorithm in service of trying to have a better understanding of whether and where gun crime can arise, okay, that's a fine exercise. But I think the bigger question is, what do we do with that information once we get it? And so specifically is the idea we're going to flood particular areas with officers. Well, how does the community feel about that? What are the sorts of rules of engagement? What are officers being directed to focus on? How are they in practice engaging residents? What, if any, complaints are arising from that? And then what sort of after action reports, analysis is being conducted to see whether those sorts of practices have been successful? And a lot of the areas where I am focusing right now, especially on a budgetary standpoint, are alternatives to policing when it comes to civilian gun violence prevention organizations. And there are a number that are doing interesting work. One in particular is one that's called READY. It's an acronym. It's READY with an I at the end, as opposed to a Y. And what they do is pretty novel. They work with street outreach folks to identify individuals who are at a high risk of being involved with gun crime, whether as a victim or a perpetrator. They identify them, provide them, if they would like, access to cognitive behavioral therapy to help them process whatever trauma they might have experienced or continuing to experience. Then access to paid job training with a job at the end of what is often, say, an 18-month period of time. And they've seen really, really positive results in terms of a significant drop in the number of participants who subsequently are involved in gun crime in one way or another. And so it's those sorts of things, really tackling the root causes of crime, which I think are really critical to elevate to the foreground right now when it comes to policy conversations at the city council level.
Yeah, for sure. I think we have one more question before we begin to wrap up, but another prevalent topic is cash bail. So the question we have is, has Chicago done anything about cash bail? If not, was it ever talked about? And if we have, what was the discussion about?
Cash bail is a very important issue that actually is a state issue, also a county issue, but a state issue as well. It's not something that we have a lot of control over at the city. So I just kind of want to be clear in that regard. You might not hear a lot of city leaders taking an initiative on it because that's not our area, that's not within our jurisdiction. But there has been a lot of movement on that over the last several years. In particular, there is a resource tool that bond court judges are directed to use, whereby instead of just making their own decisions around whether and to what extent they want to offer bond in a way that's kind of hard to track person to person from a consistency standpoint, they're supposed to start the conversation with this tool, which is you put in some information around person's history in varying ways, and then it provides some very low-level general recommendations around a person's risk of committing a new offense or not showing up to a subsequent court hearing. And it's from there that you're able to have a conversation. That shouldn't be the end of it, but it's to start a conversation among the judge, the defense attorney, and the prosecutor around what sort of release decision should be made. And with the idea being fundamentally that a person's inability to pay bail shouldn't be the sole reason why they are continuing to be incarcerated, especially when they're presumed innocent until proven guilty, because we're talking about the sorts of really incarceration, jailing somebody in advance of a trial. So we're not talking about someone who's already been found guilty, for example. So we have seen, as a result of this set of reforms, as well as some reforms that have been initiated primarily from the state's attorney's office, working hand in hand with the public defender's office, we've seen a significant drop in the number of folks who are being jailed in Cook County Jail, which I think at bottom is a very, very good thing. One of the things that we do want to make sure that we track is whether judges are consistently using this tool or otherwise talking about whether someone is at risk of not showing up subsequently or committing a new offense. but also are the folks who are there folks who still can't pay even a modest amount, or do we need to reconsider that approach? I believe that we do. I fundamentally don't believe that the evidence shows that paying bond, especially a significant amount, is going to be a deterrent. So we need to think about stuff in a more creative way. By the way, the federal government doesn't have bail either. You are jailed for the pendency of criminal proceedings because you pose a serious risk to yourself or others, or you get released, and it's not around whether you can pay. So I think that we're moving in the right direction. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done in terms of bond reform. Some folks at the state level, especially State Senator Robert Peters, really been a leader when it comes to this issue. So again, Robert Peters, you should follow him on social media and see what he has to say in terms of updates and policy proposals around this important issue.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we have. Thank you so much, Alderman Martin. I'm gonna let Anthony come back on and close this out, but thank you so much for your time. I know I learned so much about just criminal justice reform in general from our conversation, so thank you.
My pleasure.
All right, everyone. So I want to say thank you again to Alderman Martin. Want to give a shout out to Jasmine for leading us in that very thought-provoking discussion. And lastly, we thank you so much for your questions. We really appreciate it. To all of our students and teens who are watching this live, and many of you who we know will watch after the fact, we're grateful and hope that this will help equip you as you prepare to debate this season. Last but not least, we want to remind you, as the banner says below, our next lecture series will take place on October the 8th. So plan to be there. We're excited to have Jessica Gingold from Equip for Equality as she joins us to talk about the criminal justice system. So please tell your friends about this. Share this on Facebook and YouTube. It'll be hosted there after this talk. But again, we thank you and we hope you have a great evening.